His real name was Irving Wexler, but it was as Waxey Gordon that he made his mark in the underworld. Born January 19, 1888, Wexler began his criminal journey as a pickpocket in the days when Monk Eastman was king of the gangsters and the horse and carriage were the normal modes of transportation. He ended it as a drug dealer when narcotics were smuggled internationally by jet airplane. In between, he etched his name into gangster history as one of the top bootleggers of the Prohibition Era. Legend has it that Irving was bestowed with the moniker Waxey during his early days as a pickpocket because he could lift a wallet from a pocket as smoothly as if it were covered with wax. This myth was probably dreamed up by a reporter or author. The truth is that the nickname was just a derivative of his surname. Friends shortened Wexler to Waxey. And somewhere along the line, Waxey became Waxey. 1905 saw Waxey with his first arrest and prison sentence for being a pickpocket, or dip, as he would have called it. He was sent back in 1908 for violating parole. After being released for the second time, he took the show on the road and was arrested in both Philadelphia and Boston. He ended up spending a combined 23 months in prison. The teens found Waxey back in New York City breaking heads as a schlammer for labor racketeer Dopey Benny Fine. At this time there was strife in the underworld between Fine's gang and the mob headed by Jack Sirocco. On the evening of January 9, 1914, the Sirocco gang threw a racket at the Arlington Dance Hall on St. Mark's Place. Across the street, Fine and three of his goons, Waxey, A.B. Beckerman and Reuben Kaplan, laid in wait. When their enemy showed, the quartet opened fire. The Siroccos ran inside the hall. Outside on the sidewalk lay an innocent bystander who was hit by a fatal bullet while passing the hall. The four gangsters were arrested, but all would be exonerated. When criminal opportunity knocked with the advent of Prohibition, Waxey wasn't quick to answer, but when he did, he threw the door wide open and became wealthier than he ever imagined. Waxey closed out the decade with a handful of arrests in both New York and Boston. By 1922 he hadn't evolved much, having been arrested for robbery, but within 3 years he was part of one of the biggest bootlegging gangs in New York City. He was also dealing in drugs. His move into the big time was the result of his hooking up with fellow gangster Max Big Maxey Greenberg. Originally from St. Louis, Greenberg was operating out of Detroit by the mid-20s. Both men were arrested in 1924 on a drug charge. Supposedly Greenberg came to New York City with grand bootlegging ambitions, and Waxey took him to see underworld bankroll Arnold Rothstein, who gave them the seed money. By 1925, their operation was so successful that authorities began to investigate them. After 3 months, they raided the gang's headquarters at the Knickerbocker Hotel in Times Square. Gordon was actually in Europe with his wife at the time, but Greenberg and some others were arrested. Confiscated were charts, radio codes and the names and addresses of customers. Waxey returned from Europe to face the music. In addition to the evidence taken during the raid, the law also had Hans Furman, the captain of one of the syndicate's rumrunners, in custody, and he was willing to testify against his bosses. Before they could get Waxey into a courtroom, however, Furman was found dead in his hotel room. It was declared a suicide. Supposedly Furman was holding a gun, but his wife said it was murder. Even though there was no trial, the rum ring halted operations. Waxey and Greenberg's next venture was beer. Instead of bringing in liquor from Europe, the duo decided to cut out the middleman and produce their own product. They wanted the Eureka Brewery in Paterson, New Jersey, which was owned by James Bugs Donovan. It's not known what kind of offer was made, but the result was that Donovan was shot to death in his car outside his girlfriend's apartment in 1929. Whether or not Waxey had anything to do with the murder, he ended up owning the Eureka. In addition to their beer enterprises, the Gordon organization was also deep into narcotics. Managing that arm of the business was Charles Chink Sherman, his brother Henry and Morris Mall, who was going by the name Murray Marks. Like Greenberg, he was a transplant from St. Louis. In 1931, Waxey's operations and notoriety were such that when New York City compiled their own list of public enemies, the #1 spot went to him. After a newspaper ran an exposé on Gordon's operations in Paterson, he and Greenberg moved their headquarters to Elizabeth, New Jersey, where they took a 6-room, $300 a week suite at the Elizabeth Carteret Hotel. The syndicate grew with their new partner, Max Hassel, called Pennsylvania's beer overlord. By 1933, the beer triumvirate were running about 14 breweries in New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania. Success was evident in Waxey's lifestyle. He owned hotels and produced Broadway shows. His family lived in a $500 a month apartment in New York City, complete with 5 servants. Each day the kids would ride horses in Central Park. To escape the summer heat, the beer mogul had a summer home in Bradley Beach, New Jersey. The gangster didn't scrimp on himself either. He wore silk underwear costing $25 a pair under his $225 suits. None of this was lost on Thomas Dewey, the youngest man ever to hold the office of United States Attorney. Dewey was ambitious and looking for gangster scalps to help build his political career. His first target was Waxey Gordon, and he gave him the Al Capone treatment. Over the course of 1930 and 1931, Waxey had earned an estimated $1.6 million and paid a grand total of $10 in taxes. While the government was preparing its case against Waxey, the beer mogul had more pressing concerns of the lethal variety to deal with. For reasons that can only be guessed at, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel wanted him and anyone associated with him dead. And since the Bug and Meyer mob had sided with Lucky Luciano during his troubles with mafia boss Salvatore Maranzano, Lucky sided with his pal. Odds are that top racketeers Louis Lepke Buckleter and Jacob Garage Shapiro also came in on the side of Lansky and Siegel. All guns were pointed at Waxey. The trouble appears to have started on April 12, 1933, when Waxey, Greenberg and Hassel hosted a meeting with 5 other men in their suite at the Elizabeth Carteret Hotel. At one point during the meeting, Waxey exited the room and went across the hall. Later he would say that he heard a noise around 4:15 that afternoon. It sounded like breaking glass or someone dropping dishes. The lifelong gangster knew the sound of gunfire when he heard it and fled out a window and down a fire escape. His partners weren't so lucky. Greenberg was found behind his desk, slumped in a chair with 3 bullets in his head. Hassel made a run for it but was dropped with a shot to his chest. Once he was down, 2 more were pumped into his head. After the murders of his companions, Waxey went into hiding. 2 weeks later he was indicted for tax evasion. He didn't bother turning himself in. It was a race to see who got to Waxey first, rival gangsters or the feds. The latter won towards the end of May when they were tipped off that their quarry could be found hiding out at a hunting lodge in the Catskills. Arrested along with him were cronies Harry Klein and Joseph Aaron. Once in custody, he pleaded not guilty to tax evasion. When questioned about the murders of Greenberg and Hassel, he admitted to being across the hall and running when he heard the shots. "If I was in that room," he told his inquisitors, "I'd have got the same thing. I'd have got the work same as they did. They was both good friends of mine." 3 days after Waxey was captured, Chink Sherman, his brother Henry and another Confederate were involved in a motorized gunfight along Broadway in Upper Manhattan. The opposing car supposedly contained Bugsy Siegel and a couple of his minions. Both cars careened along the Great White Way exchanging shots. In the end, only 2 innocent bystanders were wounded. 5 days later, a large green sedan pulled up near the corner of Allen and Rivington Streets on New York's Lower East Side. A quartet of hoodlums alighted from the car and, in front of numerous witnesses, dragged 46-year-old underworld character Joseph Trove from the back seat. He had been severely beaten and they dumped him in the gutter. Then, drawing their guns, they fired several rounds into his body. The gunman then casually re-entered the car and pulled away. In the mid-20s, Trove received much notoriety when he was arrested for being the fence for the infamous Whitmore gang of jewel thieves. It was noted at the time and brought up again after his murder that he was a friend of Waxey Gordon's. At the time of his death, it was speculated that he had crossed some criminals and paid the price, but later developments may point to a different motive. After spending 12 days in jail, Waxey was released on June 2 after posting a $75,000 bail. He was released just in time to see his gang get decimated. A few hours after his release, a car was found in the Bronx containing the body of his associate Abe Durst. That night, across the river in Passaic, New Jersey, another colleague, Charles Brady, was machine-gunned from a passing auto while walking. 2 days later, another Waxey operative, William Big Bill Oppenheim, was climbing the steps to his Paterson, New Jersey apartment when he heard his name being called. He turned and 2 gunmen fired 5 shots into his face. After he tumbled to the ground, several more rounds were fired into his body. 2 hits were planned to go off simultaneously for the morning of June 8. One in Manhattan and one in Newark, New Jersey. At 5:10 a.m. Leon Kramer and his roommate Leo Schneider, another St. Louis transplant, just returned to their rooms on East 88th Street. Moments later, gunmen made their way inside and sprayed the place with bullets. Both men were seriously wounded and Schneider died the following day. An interesting component to this murder is that Leon Kramer was part of the Whitmore gang that the late Joseph Troe fenced for. He had escaped from prison the previous August. Though speculative, it is the belief of this site that Troe was kidnapped by Waxey's enemies and beaten until he gave up the whereabouts of Kramer and Schneider, and possibly others. That would explain why he wasn't simply shot down in the streets. They beat him for a reason before killing him. While Kramer and Schneider were getting the works, over in New Jersey, Gus Berger, a St. Louis boy like Schneider, was just getting ready to sleep. He was more careful than his confederates. He had locked himself in the apartment that he shared with his sister and her toddler son. He sat up all night spying on the neighborhood with a pair of binoculars, waiting for the attack that he knew was coming. Just after he laid down, there was a knock at his door. As his sister approached, 3 men burst into the apartment and pushed her aside. They ran to Gus's bedroom and started to kick the door in. Gus was ready for them. As soon as the door opened, bullets were flying in each direction. Gus managed to hit one of his attackers while taking a bullet himself. Though wounded in the shoulder, he managed to keep up the gunplay and retreat to the bathroom and lock himself in. His attackers fled. The extermination of the St. Louisans continued with the murder of Albert Goldfeder, a longtime associate of Max Greenberg. His body was found 2 days later in Hillside, New Jersey. Following the murder of his pal Big Bill Oppenheim, beer runner Meyer Jacobs fled Paterson, New Jersey, and moved to New York City. On June 20, as he was driving up Broadway, another car sped up alongside him and sprayed his car with a fatal volley of bullets. 3 of which hit Jacobs in the head and 1 in the neck, causing him to crash his car before succumbing to his wounds. The slaughter continued with the killing of Murray Marks on June 29. Marks was a St. Louis gangster, whose real name was probably Morris Mall. He was brought in by Max Greenberg to operate in the narcotics side of the business. As he stepped off a bus in the Bronx, a gunman ran up and shot him several times. 2 more members of Waxey's drug cartel, Harry Mackley and Frank Keller, were bumped off later that summer. Both men were part of the St. Louis arm of the organization. Earlier in the year, Greenberg, Marks and Mackley had all applied for pistol permits in Troy, New York. With the unhealthy environment in the New York region, Mackley and Keller headed west to California. They may have thought themselves safe a continent away, but there was no outrunning the Lansky, Siegel, Luciano and Lepke syndicate. On the evening of August 28, Mackley and Keller were dining in a fashionable Italian restaurant in Los Angeles. A waiter had just set down their entrees when a sedan pulled up and 3 men stepped out. Casually entering the eatery, they headed straight for the booth containing the 2 gangsters. 2 of the men drew guns and fired several shots into the duo's heads. The job complete, the third man drew a gun and escorted his companions back to the waiting sedan. Waxey's only remaining officers were Chink Sherman and his brother Henry. That fall, Henry couldn't take the stress of being on the spot any longer and put a bullet in his head. Chink took a powder and disappeared. Gangland caught up with him in 1935 and put him in a shallow grave. His gang all but obliterated, Waxey went on trial for tax evasion in late November 1933. On December 1, he was found guilty and sentenced to a decade behind bars and shipped off to Leavenworth. With time off for good behavior, he ended up serving 7 years and was released on November 20, 1940. When greeted by the press after his return to New York, he informed the reporters that, quote, "Waxey Gordon is dead. That's over. It's Wexler I'm interested in." Turns out that Irving Wexler was just as crooked as Waxey Gordon, and before long he was getting picked up periodically. During World War II, Waxey was arrested for violating rationing rules after he sold 15 tons of sugar on the black market and was sentenced to a year. After being released, he was arrested again in 1947 for receiving stolen goods but was acquitted. As the 1950s approached, Waxey, who began his career picking pockets at the dawn of the century, was again knee-deep in narcotics. He was dealing with Los Angeles-based mobster Mickey Cohen and another dealer named Harry Happy Meltzer, until both were sent to prison. Authorities knew that Waxey was involved with Meltzer and Cohen but lacked proof. That came when a dealer who had been arrested cut a deal for himself and agreed to set up Gordon. The dealer introduced the aging gangster to an undercover agent posing as a dealer. Twice Gordon sold the agent large quantities of heroin. A third deal was set up, and when Waxey arrived with his entourage, they were arrested. Once he realized what was happening, the gangster, now in his early 60s, dropped to his knees and with clasped hands screamed, "Please kill me. Shoot me. I'm an old man and I'm through. Let me run and shoot me." One of Waxey's young companions took an agent aside and thrusted $2,500 and 2 diamond rings into his hand. "Let Pop go," he pleaded. "If it isn't enough, I'll give you 25,000 more, and if that isn't enough, I'll give you still more." The agents weren't accepting bribes, however, and Pop was carted off to prison. At the age when most men are contemplating retirement, Waxey received a sentence of 25 years to life. In May 1952, he was sent to San Francisco to stand trial as part of a nationwide heroin ring. While there, he was placed in the hospital wing of Alcatraz due to his failing health. It was there on June 24 that Irving Wexler, aka Waxey Gordon, cheated the U.S. government out of 25 years by dying of a massive heart attack. If you would like to learn more about New York City's Prohibition-era gangsters, please check out my books. Links are in the description. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and consider subscribing. If you'd like to support the channel, there is a PayPal link in the description. Thank you.